The scream came from inside the merchant's tent, sharp and sudden, cutting through the noise of the crowded market square. Alina Whitfield was already moving before she had time to think, pushing past baskets of grain and startled shoppers, her healer's bag swinging against her hip. Inside the tent, a man lay on the ground clutching his arm, blood soaking through his sleeve. Another man stood over him, breathing hard, a broken crate at his feet. A dispute over stolen coin had turned ugly in seconds, and now half the market had gathered to watch, some shouting for guards, others simply staring. Alina dropped to her knees beside the injured man without hesitation. "Someone bring me clean water," she said, her voice calm but firm enough to cut through the chaos. "Now, please." A boy nearby snapped out of his shock and ran for the well. Alina pressed her hand against the wound, applying steady pressure while she checked the man's pulse with her other hand. He was pale, frightened, but breathing. "You're going to be fine," she told him, meeting his eyes. "Look at me, not at the blood, at me." The man standing over him, the one who had caused the injury, was still shaking with anger, fists clenched, looking for another target. Alina glanced up at him without fear. "He's not going anywhere," she said evenly. "Whatever happened here, it's over now. Nothing you do next will undo what's already been done, but you can still choose not to make it worse." Something in her voice made the man pause. The crowd around them fell quiet, waiting to see what would happen. Slowly, the anger drained out of his shoulders. He stepped back, running a hand over his face, suddenly looking more tired than furious. Alina returned her attention to the wound. The boy arrived with a bucket of water and she worked quickly, cleaning the cut, checking that it wasn't as deep as the blood made it look, wrapping it with practiced hands. Within minutes, the man on the ground was sitting up, pale but steady, thanking her in a shaky voice. At the edge of the crowd, a tall figure in a plain gray traveling coat stood watching. He had arrived in the town only an hour earlier, dressed deliberately without any mark of his rank, wanting to see his lands and his people without the weight of his title following him everywhere. He had not expected to see anything worth remembering. His name was Alexander Voss, Duke of Ashcombe, and for 3 years he had moved through the world like a man carved from stone. He attended council meetings, signed treaties, inspected estates, and returned every evening to a palace that felt more like a tomb than a home. Women had been presented to him more times than he could count, daughters of nobles, foreign princesses, wealthy heiresses hoping to catch his eye. He had looked at none of them, not truly. Grief had hollowed him out until nothing else could get in. But here, in this dusty market square, something had shifted. He watched the young woman work. She was not dressed like anyone of importance, a simple brown dress with a healer's satchel over one shoulder, dark hair pulled back in a hurried knot, sleeves pushed up past her elbows. There was nothing about her that spoke of wealth or status. And yet she had walked into danger without a second thought, had spoken to an armed and furious man with more authority than most generals Alexander had ever met, and had done it all with a steadiness that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. He found he could not look away. "You there?" called a voice, and Alexander realized a merchant beside him was speaking. "You're new to town. That's Alina, the healer's daughter. Best pair of hands in the district, they say. Cooler head too when things go wrong." "Alina," Alexander repeated quietly, as if testing the shape of the name. "Whitfield," the merchant added. "Her father used to run the apothecary before his health failed. Now it's mostly her running things. Half the town owes her a debt they can't repay in coin." Alexander said nothing more, but he kept watching as Alina finished bandaging the wound and helped the injured man to his feet. She spoke to him gently, told him to rest and come back the next day to have the dressing changed, and refused the few coins he tried to press into her hand. "Keep it for your family," she said, waving him off. "I didn't do anything more than anyone else would have." That, Alexander thought, was not true at all. He had watched enough men in positions of power to know that most people froze in moments of danger, or worse, made things worse trying to look brave. Alina had done neither. She had simply acted, without needing anyone's permission or approval, without waiting to see what others would do first. The crowd began to disperse, the excitement of the afternoon fading back into the ordinary rhythm of market day. Alina packed away her supplies, wiped her hands on a cloth, and turned to leave the tent, likely heading toward whatever task had brought her to the market in the first place. For a moment, as she passed through the crowd, her gaze swept briefly across the square and landed, for just an instant, on Alexander. She did not know who he was. To her, he was only a stranger in a gray coat, unremarkable among the dozens of other faces in the market. But something about the way he was looking at her made her pause just slightly before she continued on her way. Alexander stood rooted to the spot long after she had disappeared into the crowd. He did not understand what had happened to him in those few minutes. He had seen countless women in his life, many of them far more polished, far more practiced in the art of catching a duke's attention. None of them had ever made him feel anything close to what he felt now, watching a stranger clean a wound in a dusty market tent. He told himself it meant nothing. He was tired from travel, unsettled by being away from the palace, seeing things through unfamiliar eyes simply because everything around him was unfamiliar. By evening, he assured himself, this strange pull in his chest would fade, and he would return to the quiet, controlled existence he had built for himself since the accident that had taken everything from him 3 years ago. But that night, lying awake in the Modest Inn where he had chosen to stay rather than announce his presence to the local officials, Alexander found himself replaying the scene again and again. The steadiness in her hands, the calm in her voice when chaos surrounded her. The way she had looked at the angry man, not with fear, but with something closer to patience, as though she understood that anger was often just fear wearing a different face. He thought of his own anger, buried deep and rarely shown, the kind that had nowhere to go because there was no one left to blame but himself. He thought of the 3 years he had spent building walls so high that even his own family had stopped trying to climb them. He thought of the marriage proposals he had refused, one after another, each time feeling nothing but relief when the conversation ended. And then he thought of Alina Whitfield, a healer's daughter with no title and no fortune, who had somehow, in the span of a few minutes, made him feel something he had believed was gone forever. By morning, Alexander had made a decision, though he could not fully explain, even to himself, why he was making it. He summoned his steward, a quiet, watchful man named Edwin who had served the Voss family for over a decade and had learned long ago not to question his employer's moods, only his orders. "I want to know everything about a woman in this town," Alexander said, standing at the window of the inn, looking out over the rooftops without really seeing them. "Her name is Alina Whitfield. She is a healer, the daughter of the local apothecary." Edwin, who had traveled with the Duke long enough to recognize when something unusual was happening, kept his expression carefully neutral. "Of course, Your Grace. May I ask what this is regarding?" Alexander did not answer right away. He was still trying to understand it himself, this strange, unfamiliar pull that had settled into his chest and refused to loosen its grip. "I don't know yet," he said finally honestly, "but I intend to find out." Edwin bowed and left to begin his inquiries, and Alexander remained at the window a while longer, watching the town slowly wake beneath a pale morning sky, wondering what exactly he had set into motion, and whether there would be any turning back from it. 3 loud knocks struck the door of the small apothecary before dawn had fully broken, and Alina sat up in bed with her heart pounding, certain something terrible had happened. She grabbed her shawl and hurried down the narrow stairs, expecting an emergency, a fever, a birth gone wrong, anything that would explain why someone was pounding on her door at such an hour. Instead, she found 2 men in fine uniforms standing on her doorstep, their coats stitched with the crest of House Voss, a silver hawk against a deep blue field. Behind them, a carriage waited in the street, polished and gleaming even in the weak morning light, far too grand for the narrow lane where Alina had lived her entire life. "Alina Whitfield?" the taller of the 2 men asked, his tone formal, almost rehearsed. "Yes," she said carefully, pulling her shawl tighter. "What is this about?" "You have been summoned to the palace of Duke Alexander Voss," the man said, holding out a sealed letter. "You are to come with us immediately." For a moment, Alina simply stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Summoned? I don't understand. I haven't done anything to draw the attention of the palace." "We were not given a reason, only instructions," the second man said, his expression giving nothing away. "The Duke requests your presence. You may bring what you need for a short stay." Alina's mind raced through every possibility, none of them good. Had someone accused her of something? Had a patient died under her care, and a family sought some kind of justice through the courts? She had heard stories of people summoned to noble houses who never returned, or returned changed, hollowed out by whatever had happened behind those high walls. "My father," she said suddenly, "he's unwell. I can't simply leave him." "Arrangements have already been made," the taller guard replied. "A physician from the capital will attend to him in your absence, paid for by the Duke's own treasury. You need not worry for his care." This only frightened Alina more. Whoever had ordered this summons clearly had resources far beyond anything she had ever encountered, and the fact that they had already anticipated her objections meant they had planned this carefully, perhaps for days. Her father appeared at the top of the stairs, leaning heavily on the railing, his face pale with worry. "Alina, what's happening?" "I don't know, Papa," she admitted, climbing back up to help steady him. "But it seems I have no choice but to find out." She dressed quickly, packed a small bag with only the essentials, and tried to reassure her father even as her own hands trembled while she fastened her cloak. He gripped her wrist before she could leave the room, his eyes searching hers. "If anything feels wrong," he said quietly, "you leave. Title or no title, you are not property to be summoned like livestock. Do you understand me?" "I understand," Alina said, though privately she wondered how much choice she would actually have once she stepped into that carriage. The ride to the palace took most of the day, the countryside slowly giving way to grander estates, wider roads, and finally the towering stone walls of the Voss family seat, rising like a fortress against the darkening sky. Alina pressed her face to the carriage window despite herself, unable to hide her awe at the sheer size of the place, gardens stretching in every direction, fountains catching the last light of the sun, guards posted at intervals along walls that seemed to have no end. When the carriage finally stopped in the palace courtyard, Alina stepped out on unsteady legs, gripping her bag as though it were the only solid thing left in a world that had suddenly tilted sideways. A woman approached her almost immediately, elegantly dressed, silver hair swept into an elaborate style, her expression curious rather than cold. "You must be Alina," the woman said, studying her with open interest. "I am Lady Beatrice, the Duke's aunt. Forgive the abruptness of your summons. My nephew is not known for his patience once he has made a decision." "Forgive me, my lady," Alina said carefully, "but I still don't understand why I've been summoned at all. I'm no one of importance. I'm a healer from a border town." Beatrice's eyes glinted with something that might have been amusement, or perhaps sympathy. "That, my dear, is precisely what makes this so interesting. My nephew has not shown genuine interest in anything or anyone in 3 years. And then he returns from a routine inspection and announces that you are to be brought here at once." Alina's stomach tightened. "Interest? I don't even know him. I've never met a duke in my life." "Apparently he saw you," Beatrice said, beginning to walk toward the palace entrance, clearly expecting Alina to follow. "In the market square, treating an injured man. He hasn't stopped speaking of it since, not that he would ever admit to such a thing directly. My nephew guards his feelings the way other men guard treasure." As they walked through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors and floors so polished Alina could see her own frightened reflection, she tried to make sense of what she was hearing. A duke, a man of immense power and wealth, had seen her for a matter of minutes in a crowded market, and had somehow decided her life needed to be uprooted because of it. It should have felt flattering, perhaps, the kind of story told in fairy tales to young girls dreaming of a different life. Instead, it filled her with a deep, uneasy dread. "I don't wish to be anyone's passing curiosity," Alina said finally, stopping in the middle of the corridor. "If that's what this is, I'd rather return home tonight." Beatrice turned back to her, and for the first time her expression softened into something more genuine. "I understand your caution, truly I do, but I have known my nephew his entire life, and I have never seen him act on impulse, not once, not even as a boy. Whatever this is, it is not a passing fancy. That alone should tell you something." Before Alina could respond, footsteps echoed from further down the corridor, unhurried but purposeful, and both women turned toward the sound. A tall figure emerged from the shadows between two tall windows, dressed now in formal dark clothing that marked his rank clearly, nothing like the plain gray coat Alina remembered from the market. His expression was unreadable, controlled in a way that seemed almost practiced, but his eyes, when they found her, held something that made her breath catch unexpectedly. "Miss Whitfield," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the tension visible in the set of his shoulders. "Thank you for coming." "I wasn't given much choice, Your Grace," Alina replied, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Something flickered across his face there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "No," he admitted. "I suppose you weren't, for that I apologize. It was not my intention to frighten you." "Then what was your intention?" Alina asked, holding his gaze despite the enormous difference in their stations, despite every instinct telling her to lower her eyes and speak more carefully to a man who held such power over her life. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and Alina watched something war behind his eyes, some private struggle she could not name. Beatrice, sensing the weight of the silence, quietly excused herself, though Alina suspected she did not go far. "I saw you," Alexander said finally, "in the market. I saw the way you handled a situation that could have turned violent, the way you spoke to a frightened, angry man and calmed him without a single weapon or threat. I have not been able to stop thinking about it since." "That doesn't explain why I'm standing in your palace," Alina said, refusing to let his words soften the anger still simmering beneath her fear. "No," Alexander agreed. "It doesn't, and I don't fully understand it myself. I only know that for 3 years I have felt very little of anything at all, and then I saw you and something changed. I am not accustomed to acting without complete certainty, Miss Whitfield, and yet here we are." Alina studied him carefully, searching for deception, for the kind of cold calculation she had expected from a man of his position. Instead, she found only a strange, guarded honesty, as though he himself was unsettled by his own actions. "I have a position I would like to offer you," Alexander continued, his tone shifting toward something more formal, more controlled, as though retreating to safer ground. "My personal physician retired last season, and I have not yet replaced him. Given what I witnessed of your skill, I believe you would serve the role admirably." It was, Alina realized, a convenient explanation, one that gave both of them a reason for her presence that did not require either of them to speak plainly about whatever strange pull had brought her here. She did not fully believe it, not after what Beatrice had told her, but she recognized an offered escape when she saw one, a way to stay without either of them having to admit to something neither seemed ready to name. "And if I refuse," she asked, "then you are free to return home tonight with my sincerest apologies for the disruption," Alexander said, and something in his voice told her he meant it, however much it clearly cost him to say. "I would not force you to stay against your will, Miss Whitfield. Whatever else you may think of me, I am not that kind of man." Alina thought of her father, of the physician already arranged to care for him, of the strange, frightened flutter in her own chest that she refused to examine too closely. She thought of the coldness in Alexander's eyes when she had first seen him across the palace, and the strange warmth she had just glimpsed underneath it. "I'll stay," she said finally, surprising herself as much as she seemed to surprise him. "As your physician." "Nothing more." "Nothing more," Alexander agreed, though something in the way he held her gaze made Alina wonder if either of them truly believed that would remain true for long. A crash of shattering glass tore through the east wing of the palace, and Alina bolted upright in her unfamiliar bed, heart hammering, before she remembered where she was. She had been at the palace only 3 days, and already her body had not adjusted to the strange sounds of a building so large it seemed to breathe on its own, corridors groaning, distant doors closing, footsteps echoing from wings she had never even seen. She threw on a robe and hurried into the hallway, following the commotion, and found two servants sweeping up the remains of a fallen vase near the base of a staircase, muttering apologies to no one in particular. A false alarm, nothing more. Elena pressed a hand to her chest, willing her pulse to slow, and became aware of another presence nearby. Alexander stood at the top of the staircase, fully dressed despite the early hour, watching the scene below with the same unreadable expression she was beginning to recognize as his default. When his eyes found her, something shifted, softened almost imperceptibly. "You didn't need to come running," he said, descending the stairs at an unhurried pace. "It was only a vase." "Old habits," Elena replied, tightening her robe around herself, suddenly self-conscious in her nightclothes in front of a duke. "In my father's shop, any loud noise usually meant someone was hurt." "A difficult way to live," Alexander observed, "always braced for disaster." "A necessary one," Elena said, "where I come from." He studied her for a moment longer than necessary, and Elena felt the familiar warmth creep up her neck that seemed to happen whenever he looked at her that way, as though he were trying to memorize something he was afraid of losing. She had noticed it several times already in her short stay, brief unguarded moments quickly smoothed over with formality, as though he caught himself feeling too much and retreated before it could show. "Since you're awake," Alexander said, clearing his throat, "perhaps you would join me for the morning meal. There are matters concerning the household staff I should discuss with my new physician." Elena knew, of course, that this was only partly true. In the days since her arrival, she had come to understand that Alexander rarely discussed household matters over meals at all, preferring instead to eat quickly and return to his study, according to the servants who whispered about his habits when they thought she wasn't listening. But she found she did not mind the excuse, whatever it truly was. "I should dress first," she said. "Of course," Alexander agreed, though something in his tone suggested he would have been content to continue the conversation regardless of her attire. Over the following weeks, a strange rhythm settled between them, one Elena could not have predicted when she first arrived, frightened and suspicious, certain she had been summoned as some nobleman's fleeting amusement. Alexander sought her out more often than any legitimate need for a physician could explain, appearing in the gardens when she took her afternoon walks, finding reasons to visit the small room she had claimed as her workspace, asking questions about her methods, her father's teachings, the border town where she had grown up. She learned slowly that beneath his controlled exterior lived a man who noticed everything, who remembered small details others would have dismissed, who carried himself with the weight of responsibilities most people could never imagine. The staff spoke of him with a mixture of respect and quiet fear, describing a master who was fair but distant, generous but closed off, as though some essential part of him had been locked away and the key discarded. It was Beatrice who eventually told her more. One afternoon in the palace gardens, while Elena tended to a bed of medicinal herbs, she had convinced the head gardener to let her plant. "He was engaged once," Beatrice said, settling onto a stone bench nearby, watching Elena work with obvious interest. "Her name was Isabel, a wonderful girl, warm in all the ways he struggles to be. They were to marry in the spring." Elena's hands stilled over the soil. "What happened?" "A carriage accident," Beatrice said quietly, "on the road to visit her family. Alexander was meant to travel with her, but urgent business kept him at the palace at the last moment. He has never forgiven himself for it, though there was nothing he could have done. The roads were treacherous that season, the accident had nothing to do with his absence, but grief rarely listens to reason." "That's why he's so guarded," Elena said, understanding beginning to settle over her like a heavy blanket. "He believes that caring for someone means eventually losing them," Beatrice said, "and so he stopped caring, or tried to, for 3 long years, until, it seems, a market square changed something in him that nothing else could." She gave Elena a meaningful look, one Elena chose not to acknowledge directly. That evening, Elena found herself walking the palace corridors long after most of the household had retired, unable to sleep, her mind turning over everything Beatrice had told her. She passed the door to Alexander's private study and noticed light spilling from beneath it, and before she could think better of it, she knocked softly. "Enter," came his voice, tired but not unwelcoming. She found him at his desk, surrounded by papers, a single candle burning low beside him. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted from surprise to something warmer when he recognized her. "You should be resting," he said, though he made no move to send her away. "So should you," Alina replied, glancing at the stack of documents before him. "What keeps you awake at this hour?" "The realm does not run itself while I sleep," Alexander said, though the joke fell flat, weighted down by something heavier beneath it. "There are always debts to settle, disputes to resolve, decisions that cannot wait for morning." Alina stepped further into the room, drawn by something she could not fully name, and settled into the chair across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. "Your aunt told me about Isabel." Alexander's expression closed off immediately, the warmth vanishing as though a door had been shut. "That is not a conversation I have with anyone." "I'm not asking you to have it with anyone," Alina said gently. "I'm here and I'm asking." For a long moment, Alexander said nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the papers before him without truly seeing them. Alina waited, unwilling to push further, understanding instinctively that some wounds could only be opened when the person carrying them chose to open them himself. "I was supposed to be with her," Alexander said finally, his voice rough in a way Alina had never heard from him. "I let business keep me behind, told myself I would follow the next morning, that a single day would make no difference. I have spent 3 years wondering if my presence would have changed anything, if I might have insisted on a different road, a different hour of departure, anything at all." "You couldn't have known," Alina said softly. "That is what everyone tells me," Alexander said, finally meeting her eyes, and Alina saw in them a rawness that made her chest ache. "It does not change the fact that I was not there, that I have not allowed myself to feel anything since, because feeling meant remembering, and remembering meant facing what I could not undo." "And now," Alina asked quietly, "what has changed?" Alexander's gaze held hers for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, heavy and fragile all at once. "I don't fully know," he admitted. "I only know that since the day I saw you in that market, something in me that had been silent for 3 years has begun, however reluctantly, to wake up again." Alina felt her own heart quicken, uncertain what to do with the weight of his admission, uncertain whether the pull she felt toward this guarded, grieving man was wisdom or foolishness. "That frightens you," she said, understanding suddenly. "Terribly," Alexander admitted, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips. "I have built my entire life around never feeling this vulnerable again, and you have undone 3 years of careful walls in a matter of weeks without seeming to try at all." "I'm not trying to undo anything," Alina said honestly. "I'm only trying to understand the man who summoned me here without explanation, and has spent every day since finding reasons to be near me." Alexander's smile faded into something more serious, more searching. "Does it trouble you, being summoned the way you were?" "It did," Alina admitted. "At first, I still don't know entirely what to make of it, but I find I no longer wish to leave, which frightens me nearly as much as your confession seems to frighten you." The candle between them flickered low, casting shifting shadows across the papers, and the small distance separating their chairs. Neither of them moved to close it further, though Alina felt the pull of it as strongly as if invisible threads connected them, tightening with every honest word spoken between them. "Perhaps," Alexander said quietly, "we are both simply frightened people, learning how to stop being frightened in our own time." "Perhaps," Alina agreed, and for the first time since arriving at the palace, she allowed herself to believe that whatever strange fate had brought her here, it might not be something to fear after all. Smoke curled beneath the door of the West Wing storeroom before anyone noticed the danger, and by the time a young servant girl spotted the thin gray tendrils seeping into the hallway, flames had already begun climbing the old wooden shelves inside, feeding on stacks of dried linens and forgotten furniture. The scream that followed sent the palace into immediate chaos. Elena, who had been reviewing medical supplies in a nearby room, rushed toward the sound along with a dozen others, arriving just as thick black smoke began pouring from beneath the storeroom door. "Get buckets now," she shouted, taking charge instinctively the way she had in the market square weeks before. Servants scattered in every direction, some toward the kitchens for water, others running to alert the household guard. Elena pressed the back of her hand against the door and felt heat radiating through the wood. "Don't open it yet," she warned a footman reaching for the handle. "If we let air in too fast, it will only feed the flames." Word of the fire spread through the palace with alarming speed, and within minutes, Alexander appeared at the end of the corridor, moving faster than Elena had ever seen him move, his composure cracking for the first time since she had known him. "Is everyone accounted for?" he demanded, his eyes scanning the gathering crowd of servants before landing on Elena with obvious relief that quickly hardened back into focused urgency. "We believe so, Your Grace," the head guard reported, "though we haven't confirmed the stable boy who sleeps near the storeroom on cold nights." Alexander's expression darkened. Without another word, he strode toward the door, and Elena's heart lurched into her throat. "Wait," she said, grabbing his arm before she could stop herself. "You can't just go in there." "If there's a boy trapped inside, I have no choice," Alexander said, already pulling free of her grip. "Then let someone else go," Elena pleaded, fear sharpening her voice in a way that surprised even her. "You're needed here alive, not lying in ashes because you couldn't wait for water to arrive." Alexander paused, something in her tone reaching him even through the urgency of the moment. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, and Elena saw the same rawness she had glimpsed in his study weeks before, except now it was tangled with fear, real and immediate. "I cannot stand by while someone under my protection might be in danger," he said quietly. "That is not the kind of man I choose to be." Before Elena could argue further, buckets of water began arriving, and the household guard, along with several strong footmen, formed a line to douse the door and the floor surrounding it. Alexander joined them without hesitation, working alongside servants as though rank meant nothing in the face of danger, his fine coat soon soaked and streaked with soot. Elena worked beside him, directing the effort with the same calm authority she had shown in the market, calling out instructions, checking that no one stood too close to the worst of the smoke, keeping a careful eye on Alexander despite herself, unable to shake the fear that had gripped her the moment she saw him move toward that door. After several tense minutes, the flames began to weaken under the steady assault of water, and the head guard, along with two others wrapped in wet cloths, finally forced the door open enough to search inside. A cry went up moments later as they emerged, carrying the missing stable boy, coughing badly but alive, having taken shelter beneath a stone alcove near the far wall. Elena rushed forward immediately, kneeling beside the boy as he was laid on the ground outside, checking his breathing, his pulse, the color returning slowly to his face as clean air reached his lungs. Alexander crouched nearby, his hand resting briefly on the boy's shoulder, relief evident in every line of his soot-streaked face. "He'll recover," Elena said after a moment, allowing herself to exhale properly for the first time since the alarm had been raised. "The smoke gave him a fright more than lasting harm, though I'll want to watch him closely tonight." "Thank you," Alexander said, and though the words were directed partly at the guards who had entered the burning room, his eyes found Elena's as he spoke, something deeper passing between them than simple gratitude. Later that night, once the fire had been fully extinguished and the damage assessed, once the stable boy had been settled comfortably with instructions to rest, Elena found herself unable to sleep, the fear of the afternoon still humming beneath her skin. She wandered toward the gardens, hoping the cool night air might ease the tightness in her chest, and found Alexander already there, seated on the same stone bench where Beatrice had once told her about Isabel. "You should be resting," she said, echoing words he had once spoken to her. "I find I cannot," Alexander admitted, glancing up at her approach. Every time I close my eyes, I see that door, and I think of how close we came to losing that boy or worse. Alina sat beside him without waiting for an invitation, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "You frightened me today," she said honestly, "watching you move toward that door as though your own safety meant nothing at all." "I couldn't stand by," Alexander said quietly, "not while someone in my care was in danger. I have lost enough to grief and helplessness. I refuse to add inaction to that list, whatever the cost to myself." "There's a difference between courage and carelessness," Alina said, turning to face him fully. "I understand why you did what you did. I even admire it, but watching you walk toward flames made me realize something I've been trying very hard not to admit these past weeks." Alexander's gaze sharpened, focused entirely on her now, the night air suddenly charged with something neither of them had spoken aloud. "And what is that?" "That I have come to care for you," Alina said, her voice steady despite the vulnerability of the words. "Far more than I intended to when I first arrived here, frightened and suspicious of your motives. And today, when I thought you might walk into danger without any regard for your own life, I understood exactly how much that caring has grown." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and Alina wondered if she had said too much, revealed too much of the fragile thing growing inside her chest. But then he reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and gently took her hand in his. "I have spent 3 years convincing myself that caring for someone only leads to loss," he said softly. "That the safest path was to feel nothing at all, to keep everyone at enough distance that their absence, should it come, would not destroy me the way Isabel's death nearly did. But you have made that path impossible to walk any longer." "Is that a good thing?" Alina asked carefully, "or a burden I've placed on you without meaning to?" "A good thing," Alexander said, and for the first time since she had met him, his smile reached his eyes fully, warm and unguarded in a way that made Alina's breath catch. "A terrifying, unexpected, entirely welcome thing." They sat together beneath the stars for a long while after that, hands still joined, neither feeling the need to fill the silence with more words. The fear of the day slowly faded into something gentler, something that felt, for the first time in longer than either of them cared to admit, like the beginning of hope rather than the shadow of loss. But even as Alina allowed herself to lean into that fragile hope, a small, cautious part of her mind remained watchful, aware that whatever this growing connection was, it had begun under circumstances neither of them had fully explained to each other. Alexander had summoned her here for reasons he had never entirely clarified, reasons Beatrice had hinted at but he himself had never spoken plainly. And somewhere beneath the warmth of this newfound closeness, Alina knew that truth, whenever it fully surfaced, would demand to be reckoned with. A letter arrived at the palace, bearing a seal Alina did not recognize, delivered by a writer who refused to identify himself before disappearing back down the long drive at a gallop. Beatrice found it first, resting on the entrance table where the household staff placed the day's correspondence, and something about the heavy black wax seal made her uneasy enough to bring it directly to Alexander rather than leaving it for his usual review. "This arrived without explanation," she said, setting it before him in his study. "No sender's name, no request for reply, only your name written in a hand I don't recognize." Alexander turned the letter over in his hands, studying the unfamiliar seal, a crest showing crossed blades beneath a crescent moon. He broke it open and unfolded the single page inside, his expression growing darker with each line he read. "What does it say?" Beatrice asked, watching him carefully. "It's from Lord Edmund Grey," Alexander said, setting the letter down with controlled precision, though Alina, entering the study just then with a tray of tea, noticed the tightness in his jaw immediately. "He claims certain debts owed to his family by mine, dating back to a dispute my father never fully resolved before his death." "What kind of debts?" Alina asked, setting the tray aside, sensing the tension in the room. "Land," Alexander said grimly. "A significant portion of the Eastern Territories, which Grey insists were wrongfully claimed by my grandfather 2 generations ago. He threatens to bring the matter before the royal council unless I agree to relinquish the land, along with a considerable sum, within the month. Can he actually do that? Alina asked. He can certainly try, Alexander said. And even if his claim fails before the council, the process itself would cost this house dearly, in coin and in reputation. Gray is not a man who plays fairly when he believes he has been wronged, real or imagined. Beatrice's expression tightened with old memory. Edmund Gray has resented this family since your father refused to allow his sister's engagement to your uncle decades ago. This is not truly about land, Alexander. This is about old wounds he has never let heal. Over the following days, the threat from Lord Gray settled over the palace like a storm cloud that refused to break. Alexander spent long hours with his advisors, reviewing old land deeds and family records, preparing whatever defense he could muster should the matter truly reach the royal council. Alina watched him grow more withdrawn with each passing day, the warmth that had begun to bloom between them since the fire slowly retreating beneath the weight of this new burden. "You're carrying this alone," she said one evening, finding him once again buried in papers long after the rest of the household had retired. "Let someone share the weight of it." "This is not a burden I can simply hand to someone else," Alexander said, though his voice lacked its usual sharpness, worn down by exhaustion. "This is my family's legacy, my responsibility." "I'm not asking you to hand it to me," Alina said, settling into the chair across from him as she had grown accustomed to doing. "I'm asking you to let me sit with you while you carry it, rather than shutting yourself away as though facing it alone somehow protects the people who care about you." Alexander looked up at her then, something softening in his tired eyes. "You truly aren't frightened away by any of this, are you? Threats from powerful men, ancient family disputes, the endless demands of a title you never asked to be tangled up in." "I've faced worse than an angry nobleman's letter," Alina said, a faint smile touching her lips despite the seriousness of the moment. "Though I admit, watching you disappear into these papers night after night worries me more than Lord Gray's threats do." Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor outside, and Edwin appeared in the doorway moments later, his usually composed face marked with unmistakable alarm. "Your Grace," he said, "there's been an incident at the Eastern stables. 2 of Lord Gray's men were caught attempting to set fire to the feed stores, apparently hoping to cripple the estate's resources before the council review." Alexander was on his feet immediately, all traces of exhaustion burned away by sudden fury. "Were they apprehended?" "Yes, Your Grace, though not before considerable damage was done. The guards are holding them now, awaiting your instruction." Alexander moved to follow Edwin from the room, and Alina, without a second thought, rose to accompany him. "I'm coming with you. If anyone was injured in the confrontation, they'll need attention." The scene at the Eastern stables was chaotic despite the guards' efforts to contain it. Smoke still rising faintly from a partially doused fire, horses whinnying nervously in their stalls, and 2 men held firmly between armed guards, their expressions a mixture of defiance and fear. One of the stable hands had suffered a nasty gash to his arm during the struggle to apprehend the intruders, and Alina immediately moved to tend to him, while Alexander confronted the captured men. "You will tell your master," Alexander said, his voice low and dangerous in a way Alina had never heard from him before, "that whatever grievance he believes he holds against this family will not be settled through cowardly attacks on innocent people and property. If he wishes to bring his claim before the royal council, he is welcome to do so. But this," he gestured toward the smoldering feed store, "this ends now." The captured men said nothing, their silence itself a kind of confirmation, and Alexander ordered them held for the local magistrate, evidence enough of Lord Gray's willingness to escalate beyond mere legal maneuvering. Later that night, once the injured stable hand had been properly treated and the immediate danger addressed, Alina found Alexander standing alone near the damaged feed store, staring at the charred remains in the moonlight, his shoulders tense with barely restrained anger. "This is what I feared," he said without turning as she approached. That protecting the people around me would mean drawing danger toward them instead. First the fire in the palace, and now this. I begin to wonder if keeping people close to me is a kindness at all, or simply another way of endangering them. You can't blame yourself for another man's cruelty, Alina said firmly, moving to stand beside him. Lord Grey chose this path, not you. You are not responsible for the actions of men determined to cause harm regardless of what you do or don't do. And yet the danger follows regardless, Alexander said, finally turning to face her, something haunted in his expression that reminded Alina painfully of the grief he carried over Isabel. I cannot lose anyone else, Alina. I cannot survive it a second time. Then let me help you carry this, Alina said, reaching for his hand, rather than pushing everyone away in an effort to protect them. Isolation didn't save you from grief before, it only left you alone with it. Alexander's fingers tightened around hers, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of unspoken fears and unspoken feelings settling heavily in the space between them. Finally, he pulled her closer, resting his forehead gently against hers, a gesture more intimate than anything they had shared before. I don't know how to do this, he admitted quietly. How to let someone matter this much again without terror consuming every moment of happiness alongside it. Neither do I, Alina said honestly. But I would rather face that terror with you than watch you face everything alone, hidden behind walls that only seem to invite more danger rather than less. They remained there together beneath the smoke-tinged night sky, the threat of Lord Grey still looming unresolved over the estate. But for the first time, Alexander did not feel entirely alone in facing it, and Alina found herself more certain than ever that whatever challenges lay ahead, she did not wish to face them from anywhere but his side. A servant's careless whisper reached Alina's ears while she sorted linens in a storage room she had not realized was connected to the kitchen corridor by only a thin wall, and what she overheard stopped her hands completely mid-motion. I heard it from Edwin himself, one voice was saying, low but not quiet enough. The Duke had her investigated the very night he first saw her in that market town, sent riders out before dawn to learn everything about her, her family, her prospects, whether she had any suitors waiting back home. Why would he go to such trouble over a healer's daughter? A second voice asked, clearly skeptical. Because he wanted her, plain and simple, the first voice said. Edwin says the Duke couldn't stop talking about her the whole ride back to the palace, obsessed with the sight of her, and had made his mind up to bring her here before he'd even learned her name properly. Alina's chest tightened painfully as the conversation continued, details she had never been told directly, pieces of a puzzle she had suspected but never confirmed. She had known, of course, that Beatrice's account of Alexander's sudden fixation had been somewhat vague, that his own explanation of offering her a position as physician had felt convenient rather than entirely truthful. But hearing it laid bare now, stripped of any romantic framing, felt like something else entirely. He had investigated her before ever speaking a single word to her, had made the decision to upend her entire life based on nothing more than a glimpse across a crowded market, without any regard for what she might have wanted, without giving her any real choice in the matter at all. The summons that had frightened her so deeply on that first morning had not been some spontaneous gesture of fate, but the calculated result of a man accustomed to simply taking whatever caught his interest. She set down the linens she had been folding, her hands trembling slightly, and made her way through the palace corridors with a growing, cold certainty settling over her. She found Alexander in his study, as she so often did these days, and the warmth that usually rose in her chest at the sight of him was, for the first time since the fire, entirely absent. I need to ask you something, she said, closing the door behind her with deliberate care, and I need you to answer me honestly. Alexander looked up immediately, sensing the shift in her tone. Of course, what is it? Did you send men to investigate me before you ever summoned me here? Alina asked, watching his face carefully for any flicker of deception. Before you even offered any pretense of a position as your physician? Alexander's expression faltered just slightly, but enough that Alina had her answer before he even spoke a word. Elena. Just answer the question, she said, her voice sharper than she intended, fear and hurt tangling together beneath her anger. Yes, Alexander admitted finally, setting down the papers he had been holding. I sent Edwin to learn what he could about you that very morning, before I had any real plan for how I would proceed. And the position as your physician, Elena continued, pressing forward despite the ache growing in her chest. Was that ever a genuine need, or simply a convenient excuse to bring me here without having to explain your true reasons? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and his silence told her everything his words might have tried to soften. It began as an excuse, he admitted finally. Though your skill has since proven genuine and valuable regardless of how it began. So I was summoned here, Elena said, her voice trembling now despite her efforts to remain composed. Not because you needed a physician, not through any honest invitation, but because you saw me for a matter of minutes and decided you wanted me, the way one might decide to acquire a rare piece of art or an interesting curiosity. It was never like that, Alexander said, rising from his desk, alarm evident in his expression now as he recognized how deeply his admission had wounded her. Wasn't it? Elena demanded. You didn't ask me. You didn't approach me honestly and give me the choice to know you first, to decide for myself whether I wished to be part of your life. You simply ordered me brought here, dressed the command in the language of employment, and let me believe over these past weeks that what was growing between us was something equal, something chosen freely by both of us. What has grown between us has been real, Alexander said, moving toward her, though Elena stepped back, unwilling to let his nearness soften the clarity of her anger. Whatever calculation shaped how you came to be here, everything since has been genuine. You must know that. How can I know that? Elena asked, her voice breaking slightly, when I don't even know if my presence here was ever truly my own choice. You took that choice from me the moment you sent writers to investigate my life before I had even learned your name. Everything since has happened within walls. You built around me before I ever arrived. Alexander's expression crumbled, the careful control he maintained so consistently finally slipping to reveal the depth of his regret. I was wrong, he said quietly. I see that now clearly, in a way I did not allow myself to see it before. I acted out of a need I did not understand, a desperation to hold on to something after 3 years of feeling nothing at all, and I did not consider, as I should have, what that need might cost you. It cost me the ability to trust that anything between us was ever truly freely given, Elena said, tears finally slipping free despite her efforts to hold them back. I came to care for you, Alexander, deeply, foolishly perhaps, believing we were finding our way toward each other honestly. Now I don't know what to believe. Please, Alexander said, his own voice rough with an emotion Elena had rarely heard from him. Don't let my failure at the beginning erase everything that has grown since. I know I have no right to ask this of you, not after what you've just learned, but I am asking regardless, because losing you now would undo whatever small progress I have made toward becoming a man capable of caring for someone again. Elena wiped at her eyes, torn between the anger still burning in her chest and the undeniable ache of watching this proud, guarded man lay himself so openly bare before her. But the wound was too fresh, too deep, and she found she could not simply set it aside because his regret seemed genuine. I need time, she said finally, stepping back further, putting distance between them that felt necessary despite how much it hurt to create it. I need to understand what is real here, and I cannot do that while I remain inside walls that were never truly open to me by choice. You wish to return home, Alexander said, understanding dawning painfully across his face. I do, Elena confirmed. Not forever, perhaps, I don't know, but for now, yes. I need to be somewhere that is entirely my own again, somewhere I chose freely, so that I might understand what I truly feel once I am no longer standing inside the very deception that first brought us together. Alexander did not argue, though the pain in his eyes spoke louder than any protest could have. I will have a carriage prepared for you at first light, he said quietly. And Elena, whatever you decide, please know that the man who has come to care for you these past weeks is real, whatever mistakes shaped how we first came to know each other." Alina left his study without responding further, her heart heavy with a grief that felt strangely similar to the one she suspected Alexander himself had carried for the past 3 years, the pain of losing something precious before she had ever fully allowed herself to claim it as her own. A council chamber filled with the realm's most powerful nobles fell into tense silence as Alexander stood before them, his father's old advisors and rival houses, alike watching to see how the Duke of Ashcombe would respond to the demand now placed formally before him. Lord Edmund Grey's claim on the Eastern Territories had finally reached this stage, and alongside it, unexpectedly, a proposal that struck Alexander far harder than any land dispute could. "Given the tensions between our houses," the council's presiding elder said, his tone carefully diplomatic, "it has been suggested that a marriage alliance might resolve matters more peacefully than continued legal dispute. Lady Charlotte Ashford, whose family holds considerable influence with Lord Grey, has expressed willingness to consider such a match, should you agree to pursue it." Alexander felt the weight of every eye in the chamber settle upon him, waiting for his response, and for a moment all he could think of was Alina, gone from the palace for nearly 3 weeks now, her absence carved into every quiet corridor and empty room he passed. "I will consider the proposal," he heard himself say, the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them, a diplomatic answer designed to buy time rather than reflect any genuine intention. The council session continued for hours after that, discussions of land boundaries and old debts filling the chamber, but Alexander found himself distracted, his mind returning again and again to the last conversation he had shared with Alina, the devastation in her eyes when she had learned the truth of how she had come to his palace, the quiet dignity with which she had chosen to leave rather than remain within a foundation built on deception. That evening, back at the palace, Beatrice found him standing alone in the gardens, staring at the same stone bench where he and Alina had once sat together beneath the stars. "You look like a man drowning," Beatrice observed, settling beside him despite his lack of invitation. "The council believes a marriage to Lady Charlotte would resolve the dispute with Grey," Alexander said quietly. "A practical solution to a practical problem." "And what do you believe?" Beatrice asked, studying his profile carefully. "I believe," Alexander said slowly, the words feeling like a confession he had been avoiding for weeks, "that I have spent 3 years since Isabel's death convincing myself that avoiding love entirely was the safest way to honor her memory, to protect myself from ever feeling that kind of loss again. And then Alina arrived, and I made every mistake possible in how I brought her into my life, because some desperate part of me could not bear the thought of simply approaching her honestly and risking her refusal." "You feared rejection more than you feared taking away her choice," Beatrice said, not unkindly, though the observation landed with the weight of truth. "Yes," Alexander admitted, "and in doing so I became exactly the kind of man I never wished to be, the kind who takes rather than asks, who commands rather than earns. I have lost her because of my own cowardice, disguised as certainty." "Then perhaps," Beatrice said gently, "it is time to stop disguising your fear as duty, and instead do the difficult, honest thing you failed to do the first time." Alexander turned to look at his aunt fully. "You mean refuse the council's proposal?" "I mean go to her," Beatrice said. "Not as a duke summoning a subject, not with guards and carriages and commands dressed up as offers. Go to her as a man, Alexander, with nothing but the truth and whatever courage you can find, and let her decide freely this time whether there is still something worth building between you." "And Lord Grey's claim?" Alexander asked. "The council expects an answer regarding Lady Charlotte." "Land disputes can be settled through fair negotiation and honest legal argument," Beatrice said firmly. "They do not require you to sacrifice your own heart on the altar of political convenience, not when you have already found something far more valuable than any territory Edmund Grey believes he is owed." That night Alexander returned to his study, and did not touch a single paper regarding the council's business. Instead, he sat for a long while in silence, thinking of Alina's face the night of the fire, the fierce protectiveness in her voice when she had begged him not to walk into flames, the warmth of her hand in his beneath the stars, and the devastation that had replaced all of it the moment she learned the truth of how deeply his fear had shaped their beginning. He thought, too, of Isabel, of the guilt he had carried for 3 long years, and realized with sudden, painful clarity that his refusal to feel anything since her death had never truly been an honor to her memory at all, but simply a prison he had built for himself, one that had nearly cost him the chance at something real with Alina before it had even properly begun. By morning, Alexander had made his decision. He summoned Edwin, though the request he gave this time bore no resemblance to the summons that had first brought Alina into his life. "I need a carriage prepared," Alexander said, "but no guards, no formal escort. I will travel alone, and I will not be announcing my arrival ahead of time." "You intend to see Miss Whitfield," Edwin said, understanding immediately. "I intend to ask her forgiveness," Alexander corrected, "and to give her, properly this time, the choice I failed to give her before. Whatever she decides, I will not force her hand again." Before departing, Alexander made one further stop, presenting himself before the royal council with a formal declaration that stunned the chamber into renewed silence. He refused the proposed marriage to Lady Charlotte Ashford entirely, offering instead a detailed, fair legal counter to Lord Grey's territorial claims, one built on genuine evidence rather than political maneuvering, and stated plainly that his heart was not a resource to be traded for the resolution of old family grievances. "I understand this may complicate matters," Alexander told the assembled council, his voice steady despite the murmurs rippling through the chamber. "But I will not build my future on the same foundation of convenience and calculation that nearly cost me the one person who has taught me what genuine connection actually feels like. Lord Grey's claim will be settled through honest negotiation, or through the courts, but not through a marriage neither party truly desires." The council chamber erupted into quiet, astonished debate, but Alexander did not remain to hear the full extent of it. He had said what needed to be said, and now there was only one place left he needed to be, one conversation left that mattered more than any political dispute or ancient land grievance ever could. As his carriage pulled away from the palace, heading toward the border town where Alina had returned to her father's small apothecary, Alexander felt something he had not experienced in 3 long years, a fragile, uncertain hope, not for the resolution of politics or the settlement of old debts, but for the possibility that honesty, however late it arrived, might still be enough to mend what his earlier fear had broken. Rain began falling just as the small apothecary came into view, and Alina, standing at the window arranging jars of dried herbs along the shelf, noticed an unfamiliar carriage pulling to a stop in the narrow lane outside, far plainer than the grand vehicle that had once carried her away to the palace, but unmistakably fine enough to draw curious glances from the neighbors. Her breath caught when she saw who stepped out of it, no guards accompanying him, no fine ceremonial coat marking his rank, only Alexander himself, soaked quickly by the rain, standing uncertainly at the edge of the lane as though gathering the courage to approach the door. Alina's father, seated near the fire with a book he had not been reading for the past several minutes, noticed her sudden stillness and followed her gaze toward the window. "Is that him?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Alina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you want me to send him away?" her father asked, his protective instincts evident despite his weakened health. Alina hesitated, watching Alexander through the rain-streaked glass, his shoulders squared despite what appeared to be genuine nervousness in the way he stood, so different from the composed, guarded Duke she had first encountered weeks ago. "No," she said finally. "I need to hear what he has to say." She opened the door before he could knock, and for a long moment they simply stood looking at each other, rain falling steadily between them, 3 weeks of separation and unspoken hurt hanging heavy in the air. "You came without your guards," Alina said finally, unable to think of anything else to say first. "I came as myself," Alexander replied, not as a duke issuing commands. I should have come to you this way from the very beginning, Alina, and I am sorrier for that failure than I know how to properly express." "You're getting soaked," Alina said, stepping back to let him inside, though her tone remained cautious, unwilling yet to fully soften despite the ache in her chest at seeing him again. Inside, her father greeted Alexander with polite but watchful reserve, offering him a seat near the fire before retreating tactfully to the back room, leaving the two of them alone amid the familiar scent of dried herbs and old wood that Alina had missed more than she cared to admit during her weeks at the grand, echoing palace. "I refused the council's proposal," Alexander said once they were alone, water still dripping from his hair despite the fire's warmth. "Lady Charlotte Ashford, a marriage suggested to resolve the dispute with Lord Grey. I told them plainly that I would not trade my heart for the settlement of old grievances, however politically convenient it might have been." Alina's eyes widened slightly, though she said nothing yet, waiting to hear more. "I also came to properly apologize," Alexander continued. "Not with excuses, not with explanations meant to soften what I did, but simply to acknowledge that I took your choice from you the moment I sent riders to investigate your life before you had ever spoken a single word to me. That was wrong, Alina, deeply wrong, and no amount of genuine feeling that grew afterward changes the fact that our beginning was built on my fear disguised as certainty, rather than honest courage." "Why are you telling me this now?" Alina asked quietly, "rather than simply asking me to forgive you and return?" "Because you deserve the full truth," Alexander said, "and because I am not here to summon you back to my palace, Alina. I am here to ask humbly, as a man with no titles to hide behind, whether you might consider giving me the chance to court you properly, the way I should have from the very beginning. No investigations conducted in secret, no commands dressed up as opportunities. Simply an honest man, asking an extraordinary woman whether she might allow him to earn her trust freely, this time, with nothing forced or arranged." Alina felt tears gathering despite her efforts to remain composed, the weight of 3 weeks of uncertainty and grief finally beginning to loosen in her chest. "You would truly give up a political solution, a resolution to Lord Grey's claims, simply to stand here and ask me this?" "I would give up far more than that," Alexander said, rising from his seat to close the distance between them, though he stopped short, leaving her the space to decide whether she wished to close the remaining gap herself. "I spent 3 years believing that avoiding love entirely was the only way to protect myself from ever losing someone again. But watching you walk away from my palace taught me something far more painful than any grief I carried for Isabel. It taught me that a life built entirely around avoiding loss is not truly a life at all, merely a slow, careful kind of dying." "And if I say no," Alina asked softly, "if I tell you that the trust between us cannot be rebuilt, that too much was broken in how we began?" "Then I will return home," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the visible pain the possibility caused him, "and I will respect your decision completely, whatever grief it costs me. You deserve nothing less than a choice made entirely free of pressure or expectation, Alina. That is the very least I owe you now." Alina studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any trace of the calculated distance she had once feared defined him, and found instead only open, unguarded honesty, the same rawness she had glimpsed that night in his study when he had first spoken of Isabel, except now unshielded by any formality or excuse. "I missed you," she admitted finally, the words breaking free of the careful composure she had maintained since his arrival. "Even angry as I was, even hurt as I remained, I missed you every single day since I left that palace, and I hated myself a little for it, because I did not know if that missing was wisdom or simply foolishness." "It was neither," Alexander said gently, closing the remaining distance between them now, reaching to gently brush away the tear that had finally escaped down her cheek. "It was simply the truth of what has grown between us, however imperfectly it began." "I want to believe that," Alina said, leaning slightly into his touch despite herself. "I want to believe that whatever we build now can be built honestly, without commands or hidden investigations or fear disguising itself as certainty." "Then let me prove it to you," Alexander said. Not in a single afternoon, not with a single apology, but over however much time it takes for you to trust fully again that what grows between us is chosen freely by us both. Alina reached up, resting her hand gently over his where it still cradled her cheek, and for the first time since she had overheard that fateful conversation in the palace storage room, she allowed herself to believe that healing, and perhaps even happiness, might genuinely be possible. "Then stay," she said softly, "for dinner at least. My father makes surprisingly good use of very little, and you look like a man who has forgotten how to eat properly while drowning in council disputes and land grievances." Alexander laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound Alina had rarely heard from him, warm and full in a way that filled the small, herb-scented room with something that felt remarkably like the beginning of hope. Weeks passed, and then months, Alexander returning to the border town again and again, never with guards, never with commands, simply as a man courting a woman he had come to love more deeply than he had ever believed himself capable of feeling again. Lord Grey's claims were eventually settled through fair legal negotiation, exactly as Alexander had promised the council, and Lady Charlotte Ashford, upon learning the full story, was reported to have wished the couple well with genuine, gracious sincerity. When Alexander finally asked Alina to marry him, it was not within the walls of his grand palace, but in the small garden behind her father's apothecary, surrounded by the very herbs she had spent her life tending. And this time, there was no summons, no command, only a question, asked honestly and answered freely. The palace that had stood cold and silent for 3 long years finally opened its doors once more, filled now with warmth, laughter, and the quiet, steady presence of a healer who had taught a grieving duke that love, chosen honestly and freely, was never something to fear, but something worth every risk it demanded.